Dana White always says that the company does even better in the new year. Every card is a must-watch, and every fight is what the fans want to see. Don't believe his lies. With MMA being the most unpredictable sport in the world, where everything can and will go wrong, you, as an MMA fan, are always a little on edge. That shiny fight that you've been looking forward to for months can fall apart with just a week to go. And don't let me get started on the matchmaking. The John Jones versus Miocic's curse was still carried into 2024, and you just knew it was going to happen and it was going to suck. But alongside the chaos and the misery, you anticipated a few moments of brilliance, maybe a violent knockout, a legendary performance, or the underdog rising to the occasion. You told yourself that as long as the UFC could deliver those fleeting moments of greatness, it was all worth it. And that was your cope to begin the year. To start off 2024, you had to sit through not one, not two, not even three, but six fucking Apex cards that were littered across the first quarter of the year. These were a relic of the COVID era, and by the third Apex event, you had grown numb. Why even watch the UFC anymore with this going on? Might as well watch the unholy Bellator PFL mutant show going on. I mean, who knows at this point? But then Volk got knocked out by Ilia Topuria in what, in hindsight, a definite changing of the guard at 145, and this brutal KO and the end of a great era of featherweights brought some life and excitement back to the sport. Only for a moment, though, as you were shortly back to the Apex train ride with abominations such as Allen versus Curtis 2 and Ribas versus Namajunas closing out these quote-unquote events. But as the first quarter came to an end, the company toned down the torture and began to pick up. UFC 299 was the UFC 300 before the actual 300, and despite a BS main event between O'Malley versus Vera, the rest of the card was stacked and delivered as expected. And right after 299, it was UFC 300 season, and Dana White promised the most epic MMA event of all time. Most of the card was booked in advance with good matchups you were looking forward to, but the main event remained TBD for months. You couldn't help but wonder, maybe the company was negotiating something truly massive for this historic card. Maybe something like Islam versus Leon? After months of speculation and a little bit of doom-mongering, the main event was finally announced. It wasn't Islam versus Leon or McGregor versus Chandler or a 47-year-old roided Brock Lesnar versus a psychotic Mark Hunt, but Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill. All the months of waiting for this? Honestly though, you didn't mind it too much. In fact, you welcomed it. It was UFC 300, and out of all the available fighters to headline this important event, you could think of no one better than a former Glory double champ who was now a UFC double champ and a surging fan favorite. With a $300K bonus on the line, UFC 300 was an event for the ages, and for the first time ever, you actually watched every fight from the starts. Congrats on not being a casual for once. With Holloway knocking out Gaethje in the last second and Poatan schooling Hill in the first round, the main card too ended up on a high note, and you felt proud to be a UFC fan. Say what you want about their favoritism and outright horrid matchmaking at times, these were two stacked pay-per-view cards back to back, and both lived up to the expectation. And in the post-fight press conference for 300, Dana White had another massive announcement to keep the good times rolling: Chandler versus McGregor for UFC 303. Your first thought was, good for Michael Chandler. The guy has been thirsty as hell for Red Panty Night booking for far too long, and he was finally gonna get it now. And while Conor McGregor was no title contender in 2024, he was still Conor McGregor, and you were definitely gonna tune in to the interviews, the press conference, and the actual fight. Interviews, only Michael Chandler yapping. Pre-fight press conference, canceled due to, quote, unforeseen circumstances. The fight? Let's talk about relevant lightweight action first, though. UFC 302 was headlined by Islam Makhachev versus Poirier, and you tuned in expecting Dustin to get steamrolled. But the lightweight legend put on a hell of an effort to dethrone Islam. He lost in the end by submission in the 5th round, but you were glad you tuned in to another fight of the year contender, with two of the best fighters on the planet giving it their all. Oh, and McGregor pulled out due to an injured pinky toe, and your foremost thought was, damn, I hope Chandler's doing okay. He wasn't. You weren't too hurt by the cancellation, and as awful as it was to you, you still had a few chuckles over the meltdown of Michael Chandler, who you imagined remained in the woods of nowhere for more than 2 weeks to come to terms with reality. But he still didn't. Anywho, Alex Pereira showed up again to save the event, facing Yuri in a rematch, and he ended that little rivalry with another memorable knockout. At the end, you were chanting Chama, Chama at the walls because just like everyone else, you were converted and now a follower of this war god. Who wouldn't be, really? Meanwhile, in some more disturbing developments, the Dana White glazing campaign for Jon Jones was now legitimately uncomfortable. Initially, it was Dana White throwing other fighters under the bus to prop up Jones as the pound-for-pound #1, but by now, Dana had shown up on every podcast and show possible and declared Jon Jones was not only the pound-for-pound best fighter, but also the greatest combat sports athlete ever. Bonus points for German Shepherds and guns. You thought it would stop, but it only gotten worse, and despite fans' backlash and some actual pushback from media members, the UFC boss doubled down and kept the slogan up, while his hope and dream began to crumble around him. Bilal dunked Leon on his head and became champion on a UK pay-per-view. Israel lost to Dricus and tapped out on an Australian pay-per-view. And finally, on the financially hopeless UFC Sphere card, Merab defeated Sean O'Malley to become bantamweight champion. The derangement started to make sense now. That was Dana White's way of coping with the losses of his corporate favorites, and there was no one left, except Jon Jones. You were going to get Jon Jones versus Stipe crammed down your throat, and you were going to like it, and then pay homage to the GOAT. It was going to be one annoying road to UFC 309 with a lot of manufactured hype and prestige and a whole lot of backwards promotion. The two fighters who actually deserved the praise and adoration, Topuria and Pereira, competed on the following pay-per-views to brighten up the dark road to Madison Square Garden. Pereira produced another brutal highlight with a knockout against Khalil Roundtree, and Topuria ended Max Holloway. No, really, he did. It took you a few seconds to compute that Max Holloway was on the ground, barely conscious, and Topuria was sipping tea in the octagon. That happened, and it was sad. The end of an old era at featherweight, and probably the end of Holloway's chin. And as a Max Holloway superfan, that sucks. By the time your morning came to an end, UFC 309 was unfortunately finally upon you, and despite the fact that you had been praying nonstop for a miracle that would allow Tom Aspinall to take the place of Stipe, the main event remained intact, regrettably. The actual fight was as you expected. It was a ghost of Stipe who had not fought in over 3 years, getting dominated and eventually finished by Jon Jones. A heavyweight great who was clearly dragged out of a retirement home for this fight was on his way out. He got a few of his internal organs rearranged, and it was a sad sight. Now that you think about it, 2024 has been a cruel year for the legends of the game. Volk, Holloway, and now Stipe, all brutal, but that loss for old man Stipe was likely the worst one. That said, there was still one more pay-per-view to go, UFC 310, so maybe your last memory of 2024 wouldn't be pure depression. By the way, remember the injury bug you were praying for to show up and ruin the main event of UFC 309? Well, he got to work a tad late and ruined the main event for UFC 310 instead. Bilal withdrew due to bone infection, and Shavkat remained on the card, and his short-notice replacement was Ian Gary. So you thought, hey, maybe the highlight of the fall would be two undefeated welterweight contenders putting on a war to commemorate a new era at 170. This Shavkat versus Gary was the real main event, the finale of the UFC in 2004, and it was going to be a definite upgrade in terms of entertainment from the previous welterweight showdown. And it really wasn't that at all, unfortunately. High IQ chess match is what they said, but for most of the time, you were hoping and bracing yourself for something to happen, for some hell to break loose, but there was very little of it. The highlights of the last pay-per-view were outrage over a horrendous robbery and Merab getting into an altercation with the fan and maybe jeopardizing his anticipated title fight against Umar. The year didn't end on a depressing well, but on a disappointing whimper. Still, as you look back at 2024, you realize it wasn't all that bad. Sure, there were stretches of mediocre fights, frustrating matchmaking, and legends falling one after another. Yet, in between the chaos, the sport delivered moments that reminded you why you're still an MMA fan. Being a UFC fan in 2024 may have tested your patience, but it also rewarded your loyalty with glimpses of greatness. It didn't suck, at least. That was your solace.